a good starting point is just to recognise that we know that well-nourished children do better. So, and I don't think anyone would argue that children who eat well do better physically, they do better mentally. And there are lots of studies to show that in neurotypical children, and have found that they do better both in terms of their physical health over the long term and their mental health and their achievement even over the long term. And I don't think anyone would really argue with that. But often when we talk about ADHD or related conditions, people are a little bit more hesitant to kind of accept that it can make such a big difference. I think partly because it's quite difficult to change children's diets, and even possibly more difficult to change children's diets when they have a neurodevelopmental condition. And I think we often kind of think of ADHD as a condition which really has a single sort of biochemical element, which is the relationship with the dopamine. But actually, it is defined as a complex, multifactorial disorder and containing many types of risk factors. And if we think about nutrition and its relationship to the brain, so nutrition is basically biochemistry. So if we think about what happens when we eat food, we eat the food, it gets broken down into its component parts, which are vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids, sugar molecules, and a whole lot of other different molecules. And those molecules are broken down into their component parts. And then those component parts actually travel around the body and act in biochemical pathways within the body and within the brain. So it would actually not make sense if what you eat didn't affect both your physical health and your mental health, because it's all about biochemistry. And so when we're thinking about nutrition and nutritional therapy, what we're doing is we're changing biochemistry by just kind of supplying more of the right kinds of nutrients and making sure that a diet has all the nutrients that a body and brain needs to work at its best. An analogy I often use, which I think it works really well, is that if you have a car, for example, and you could just put fuel in that car every week, whatever, and it would run and run and run. But if you never took it for its MOT, and you didn't put air in the tyres, and you didn't, polish the outside, and you didn't replace the interior light bulb when it blew, and you didn't put oil into it, it would still run, but it wouldn't run as well as it did when it was new. And nutrition is about doing all those little tweaks to keep our brain and body in top working order. And that's really, obviously, particularly important for children because they're growing and developing. So it's not just maintaining, but it's also about growing. So these are just, often people say when I talk about nutrition and ADHD, they say, well, there's not really a lot of evidence, is there? So I thought, well, first of all, I'll just show you, here's just a handful of studies that are all very, very recent that are looking at diet and nutrition, and obviously diet and ADHD. Obviously, I won't have time to talk about all of these aspects today, but just to give you a flavour. And we are going to put these slides up onto the ADHD website, so you'll be able to have a look at these and dig around in more detail if you'd like to. So I'm just going to talk about a few. I don't want to get too stuck into all the science, but I think it's good to see that there is some science behind all of this. So this is a study that was done actually quite a few years ago. Just a small study, 20 children with ADHD, and they compared Ritalin with dietary supplements. So the children were given either Ritalin, the medication, or a combination of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, which is plant-based nutrients, amino acids, fatty acids, these substances called phospholipids, and probiotics, so good bacteria for the gut. So it was a bit of a combo program. And they found that there was significant improvements, as you would expect, in the Ritalin group, but also in the nutrient group. And actually they concluded that the food supplement treatment of ADHD may be of equal efficacy to Ritalin. So I thought, it's only a small study, but I thought it was very interesting. This one was looking at, again, micronutrients for people with ADHD. These were children aged 8 to 12 years. And they spent 8 weeks on a micronutrient program. And they had statistically significant reductions in ADHD symptoms, improved mood, improved overall functioning, etc. And so 71% showed at least a 30% decrease in ADHD symptoms, and 79% were identified as much improved or very much improved. So again, small study, but quite impressive in terms of the amount of improvement that you can get just from this one aspect. This one was looking at adults with ADHD, which a slightly bigger study, 80 adults, again 8 weeks, micronutrients, and again they saw big differences in on the scales that they measured in. So it's just a flavour of the sort of these multiple nutrient studies with ADHD. I thought this was also a useful paper to look at from the American Journal of Public Health, and it did a systematic review. So basically, a systematic review is when they go out and they just look at all the research that's there and then kind of homogenise it and so that they can draw conclusions from a big body of research. And they reviewed 12 studies to determine whether an association exists between diet quality and diet patterns and mental health in children and adolescents. And so their conclusion was they observed a consistent trend for the relationship between good diet quality and better mental health, and some evidence for the reverse, obviously saying that better diet contributed to better mental health, worse diet, worse mental health. So that's quite a good study. And one of the reasons that diet's quite important, if we think about ADHD in particular, so many of you will be familiar with the role that dopamine plays in ADHD, and that most of the medication for ADHD obviously affects the dopamine pathway. So where does dopamine come from? Well, when you eat protein food, or your child eats protein-rich food, it provides these two amino acids. This is L-phenylalanine, and this is tyrosine. And so when the protein food is broken down into its component parts, it releases these two amino acids, and then these two amino acids get processed. This one actually gets processed into this one, and then both of them are processed into something called L-dopa, and then into dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. So to enhance this pathway, you can look at where the protein is, where the amino acid's coming from, but also crucially, these here are all nutrients. So folate, what you might know better as folic acid, magnesium, manganese, iron, copper, zinc, and vitamin C. And so those nutrients, vitamins and minerals actually affect biochemical pathways. So when we try to create or break down neurotransmitters, so those chemical messages in the brain, is actually the vitamins and minerals which help or hinder that process. So just kind of to illustrate the biochemistry that really underlies neurotransmitter production. So I'm sure all of you will have heard of omega-3 fatty acids and fish oils, and many people, who's tried the fish oils? Yeah, it's probably one of the most popular things. I mean, the reality is that in general, one single factor doesn't usually work, because ADHD is not a simple one factor sort of disease. It's multifactorial, and so for some people the fish oil has a huge, remarkable effect. For some people it might have a very tiny effect, maybe not even noticeable, and for other people there are other factors which are much bigger slices of that pie. And so we never put all our eggs in one basket. We never think it's all about omega-3 or it's all about sugar. It's about the totality, everything that you do. And of course, I would say alongside that, of equal importance, is all of the different teaching support, psychological support, physical activity. All of those things have to kind of come into the mix. We don't ever think sort of one thing is going to do it. But in terms of the evidence, there's quite good evidence for omega-3. And the reason it's quite important is because the brain essentially is made of fat. So the largest part of the brain is made of fat, and the omega-3 fatty acids are very important in terms of the receiving of chemical messengers. So they have a big part to play in when chemical messengers are sent and then received in the brain. They're also highly anti-inflammatory, and we know that children on the spectrum are likely to have higher levels of low-grade inflammation. So not the sort of inflammation that you get if you sprain your ankle, but the sort of low-grade inflammation that contributes to chronic disorders. And omega-3s are highly anti-inflammatory. So we get them from oily fish, fish oil capsules, linseeds, walnuts, and even from green leafy vegetables. So in my clinic, we often run blood tests or other tests on children. And one of the tests that we run is a fatty acid profile. And basically that measures the levels of the omega-6 fatty acids, omega-9 fatty acids, the omega-3 fatty acids, and different saturated fats. So we can see what the level is like actually in any individual child. What we find almost always is that it's the omega-3, the EPA and the DHA that you get specifically in fish oil that is low. The other fatty acids tend to be okay. Most kids are getting enough of those sort of fatty acids, but it's the EPA and the DHA from fish oil. And even amongst kids who are supplementing already, their levels can be low. And in fact, I haven't got the study here, but there was one which I saw, which is from Canada, where they compared, they had teenagers with ADHD and neurotypical teenagers of the same age, etc. And they measured their blood levels of fatty acids, and they measured their dietary intake. So you would expect that if all the teens achieved a certain amount through the diet, that their blood levels would be about the same. But they found that even when they were eating the same amount, taking in the same amount, that actually the blood levels in the teenagers with ADHD were actually lower, which suggests that somehow or rather in the biochemistry, kids with ADHD need more omega-3 than neurotypicals. So this was one of the studies that's been published, which is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So again, this is kind of trawling through all of the studies that have been done on omega-3 and ADHD, and kind of coming to an overall conclusion. And they found that omega-3 fatty supplementation was modestly effective in the treatment of ADHD, which I think, in science speak, I think is quite encouraging. And they said it was modest compared to the pharmacotherapy, so modest compared to the drugs, but you would expect that because it doesn't have a drug-like effect. It has a more kind of subtle but longer-lasting and cumulative effect. But also what they kind of commented on here was that given its relatively benign side effect profile and evidence of modest efficacy, it might be reasonable to use omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. So what they're kind of saying is that it had a good effect. Maybe it wasn't quite as strong as a drug effect, but it also doesn't have any side effects. So as something that you might want to kind of throw into the mix and add into everything else, it makes sense. I think it's also useful to think about childhood depression. We know that childhood depression is something which is also on the rise a lot for a number of different reasons, and also can be comorbid with ADHD. So medication that would typically be used in depression in adults, we know is not generally recommended in children because there are concerns about side effects. So this was quite an important pilot study. Small study, 28 children, aged between 6 and 12 with major depression, so that's the most serious form of depression. And they were given omega-3 fatty acids or placebo for 16 weeks. And they found the highly significant benefits of omega-3 versus placebo. So again, for children suffering with low mood, it may be that low levels of fatty acid are a factor, and that omega-3 fatty acids could be helpful. On to superfoods. So what makes a superfood a superfood? Well, really it's just a newspaper headline. There is no such thing really as a superfood. But how they get their name is because they tend to contain substances which are have certain properties. And so if you look, whenever you see a superfood, look and see what's in it. And what you'll find is in it is things like this: flavonoids, anthocyanins, sulforaphane, curcumin, all of these substances which are called polyphenols or phytonutrients, which are in these superfood type foods. And there's lots of research going on to assess the impact that these sorts of foods can have on brain function. So many of you, I'm sure, I don't know, who's heard of turmeric and how good it is for the brain? Yeah, exactly. That's mostly in the area of dementia and kind of brain as we get older. I don't know if you've heard of how good cocoa solids might be for the brain. It's always good news. And obviously it's the dark stuff, blueberries. Everyone knows blueberries are good for you. And there was even a study, which I don't think I've got. No, I don't have it. There was even a study where they took broccoli sprouts, so part of the brassica family, and they used them in a study of adult males with autism, and found actually a significant reduction in autism behaviour with broccoli sprouts. Obviously high potency or high concentration broccoli sprouts. So there've been quite a few different studies, and there isn't enough research at the moment to sort of suggest. Again, it's like the fish oil. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's not all about blueberries, and it's not all about chocolate. But what we tend to say, one of the phrases that we tend to use, is eat a rainbow. So try and have as much colourful different foods in the diet as possible. And we know that for many children, it's the beige carbohydrates that they tend to gravitate towards, and moving them away from those and onto the more colourful foods, I recognise can be a challenge. I mean, I was talking earlier that one of the things that I do in the clinic, it's not just about saying, introduce more of these sorts of foods, it's also working on how to introduce the foods and working with each individual child, because each individual child, of course, has their own things about food, and finding a way that works, and whether it's stickers and stars, or whether it's some kind of other type of incentive or reward scheme, or whether there's a bit more deception going on, or whatever it might be, whatever works is what we do, but it's really about tailoring it to the individual needs of the child. So sleep. It's probably, even amongst the adults that I see, sleep problems are a huge issue, across the country and worldwide. And children who don't sleep well have worse behaviour, and there are studies which demonstrate this. They have worse behaviour, worse concentration. Of course, we know that ourselves, because when we don't sleep well, do we feel great? No. So of course, then it makes it worse. For children with ADHD, it's going to just make everything worse. So one of the nutrients that's one of my favourites that I recommend a lot is magnesium. Has anyone tried magnesium? Or okay, a few here. Okay. So if magnesium was a patentable drug, it would be a blockbuster, for sure. The reason that most people don't know about it is because you can't patent a nutrient. So if something occurs naturally, you can't patent it, therefore it's not very profitable. And so whilst the evidence for magnesium as a calming and relaxing mineral has been around for nearly 100 years, there are papers going back to 1921. Because there's no money to be made from it, there isn't enough research, and there certainly isn't the promotion that there could be. So we call it nature's tranquilizer. It is commonly deficient, so again, when we do blood tests, we often find that magnesium levels are low. And deficiency problems include things like sleep issues, anxiety, constipation, hyperactivity, depression, and cramps. The main food source are green things, of course, children's favourite foods. And it's part of the green chlorophyll, which helps the plant to photosynthesize, contains magnesium. So that's why the high magnesium. And also seeds are very good for magnesium. But most people find it difficult. Most of us probably find it difficult to get enough in our diet, and most children definitely do. And I think one of the problems is that food which is intensively farmed is going to be lower in magnesium than food which is farmed in a more sort of old-fashioned or sustainable way, because the magnesium doesn't get put back into the soil. In fact, studies that have looked at organic food versus non-organic have found higher levels of magnesium in organic food. So we do often use a supplement of magnesium for kids who are struggling with hyperactivity, concentration, and sleep. Another key sort of superstar nutrient is zinc, and this one is, again, when we measure it in blood, it's often low, but also even the government's national diet and nutrition surveys will tell you that children do not get enough zinc in their diet. They just do not eat enough zinc. So it's essential for growth and immunity. So kids with white spots on their fingernails often are zinc deficient. Kids with stretch marks. So I often think of that as relation to pregnancy, but some children who go through a bit of a growth spurt, or young boys who start going to the gym and they develop stretch marks, that's a zinc deficiency. And so zinc also has antidepressant properties, so there have been a few studies now which show that, and it has a huge range of roles to play in the brain. So food sources, oysters are by far and away the best source of zinc. Obviously, not that many kids are into their oysters, but there are lots of other good sources as well: nuts, seeds, lamb, sardines, eggs, pulses. But again, it's, a varied diet is going to provide more zinc than a fairly narrow diet. I think this is one of the challenges that we have. On to the sugar. You knew it was coming. So I'm just going to show you a couple of studies, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So this is ADHD and sugar beverages, and 173 children with ADHD and 59 controls, and they found a dose-response relationship between sugar-sweetened beverages and ADHD. So basically, the higher the consumption, the worse the ADHD. And I know it's a real point of contention. There will be some parents who say, well, I don't see any difference at all. There are some parents who will say, well, I totally can see it. But one of the things that it's important to realise with sugar, that it's not just about the impact of the sugar when it's consumed, that you get the sugar rush and then it wears off. And for some children you'll see an effect, and for some children you won't. It's because sugar acts on the brain like a drug. So some of you will have seen, I'm sure, that when they've done studies where they've given animals and humans sugar or cocaine or other drugs, and they have the brain in a scan, like an MRI type scanner, and the bits of the brain light up, the same bits of the brain light up on cocaine as sugar. So that's got to tell you something. So one of the problems with regular sugar consumption, it's the same with regular drug consumption, in that it's overstimulating the brain and becomes a bit of a dependence. And so it's not good for the brain in the short term, but it's also not good for the brain in the long term. And of course, we know that when we see foods, sugar, biscuits and cakes and sweets and things like that, we know that they're high in sugar, and most of us will do our best to moderate them. But worse than that, actually, and more tricky than that, is the sugar that's hidden in all of the healthy foods. So sugar is the pure form of carbohydrate. So when we eat carbohydrate foods, bread, pasta, rice, potato, etc., we eat that and it breaks down into individual sugar molecules. Some of those foods break down really quickly, so it's just like a flash flood of sugar into the bloodstream, and some of them break down really slowly. And so what we ideally want is slower releasing carbohydrates that are going to break down slowly, so we don't get that drug-like effect lighting up the brain, and we don't get that energy high and low. So many people will try to make the right choices, but then we're up against all of the marketing, which is telling us this is a healthy option, and the reality is mostly it's not. So some of the things which are that I most often see in a diet where people are trying to be healthy but they're just kind of falling into these traps are things like fruit yogurts are often low-fat fruit yogurts, high in sugar, low in fat, and more sugar than most people realise. Breakfast cereals, even the ones which say they're healthy, apart from plain oats, all those other ones, and especially the ones which are crunchy, clustery, the ones I'm talking about, they are the worst. But even the sort of healthy veneer type ones, the ones with the nice brown cardboard box that you think, well, that looks healthy, they've got more sugar than you realise. Juices and smoothies. So if you make a juice or smoothie yourself at home and you know what you've put in it, that's one thing, and there are things that you can do to reduce the sugar effect. But bought juices and smoothies are very, very sugary. They might as well be the same. They really are the same as a soft drink. And even things like white bread, white pasta, white rice have quite a sugary effect, because that's the problem. They go in and they break down into sugar really quickly, so you get that the sugar rush. Has anyone seen this film? Yeah, what do you think?
Love it.
Love it, yeah, brilliant. So this is a brilliant film, and I think that it's so basically the guy who, it's a bit like Super Size Me for those of you who remember that, and he goes on a bit of a mission and he decides that he's going to eat more sugar, but only the hidden sugar in healthy food. So he doesn't eat junk food, he eats cereal bars and healthy cereals and all of the good, low-fat fruit yogurt and all those sorts of things which we're led to believe are really healthy. And he does this for a month. He does some measures at the beginning, he does some measures at the end. Really good, but it's a really good journey, and I think it's a really great thing for kids to watch, because then often it's the kids who say, oh no, we can't have that. That's got far too much sugar in it. So really good. You can download it, Netflix, YouTube, etc., buy the DVD or whatever. So maybe a good Christmas present for somebody. So I would highly recommend that, and it makes your job easier. The other thing, that if we eat protein, fat and fibre with carbohydrates, what happens is that slows the rate at which those sugar molecules get into the bloodstream, because it kind of just gets in the way and it slows the emptying of the stomach. So eating a bowl of pasta with not much on it is much faster release in sugar than eating sort of a spaghetti bolognese, which has got the meat and maybe it's got some vegetables with it. That slows the release of the carbohydrate element of the pasta. So try and always have mixed meals as much as possible. So people are usually fine adding protein and fibre to food, but people often say to me, but you can't add too much fat, can you? Because that's really unhealthy. Or is it? So most of you are probably aware the tide is turning. Fat is good. If you didn't hear it already, you've heard it here first. So most of the information that tells us that fat is bad for us came about from the 1950s through the 1970s based on some very poor science. And then a lot of vested interests followed up, and there are still many vested interests today. Fat is not bad. Fat is only bad when it comes combined with sugar. So ice cream is not a healthy food, not because of the fat, but because of the sugar. Cakes are not healthy, not because of the fat, but because of the sugar. So if it's fat without sugar and not deep fried fat, then fat is actually good for us. So some things I think most of us will already be well aware of, nuts and seeds, oily fish, olives, olive oil, are really good for us. Avocados, who doesn't like an avocado? But also, butter, eggs, meat. Better quality meat is much better than poor quality meat, so it's better to have smaller amounts of good quality than large amounts of cheap, poor quality. Coconut oil, this is ghee, so clarified butter. So these are all really good things to include in the diet. And what's good about them, besides the fact that they contribute to our health in many ways and to the brain's health, is that they make food more satisfying. So they take away this drive to want to eat sugary foods, because actually you eat food with fat in it and you get a feeling of satisfaction which is missing if you eat low-fat food. And so often you'll see children will be constantly looking for the next sort of sugar or snack or some kind of fix. If there's more good fat in their food, they actually can feel more satisfied, and that pattern can start to reduce. So increasing more fat is definitely important. Yes.
How does that marry up with keeping your weight under control?
Yes, so fat doesn't make you fat. In fact, here's a book recommendation for you. It's called The Big Fat Surprise. Guess what the surprise is?
It doesn't make you fat.
Yeah. So fat doesn't make you fat. I know it's one of those things that we all believe, we're all brought up on it, and it's obvious, isn't it? You eat fat, you get fat. How simple can it be? The problem is, biochemistry is not that simple. What goes in isn't necessarily what ends up on your hips. So sugar is actually what makes us fat. So the body can, when we eat sugar, the excess is converted into fat. It travels around in our arteries, which is when we actually have problems with fat in our arteries, not because of what we ate, and not the fat we ate, but the sugar that we ate, and that's what makes us fat. And it's sugar that which contributes to all the fat around the organs, which of course is the worst type of fat. So, and the other thing which actually is helpful is that if you have more fat in your food tastes so much better and is so much more satisfying that instead of having a big pile of rice or pasta or potato, you only want a smaller amount because it's just so much more satisfying. But yes, The Big Fat Surprise. I would highly recommend that book to anyone. the next thing is the microbiome, or the gut flora, as it's called. So again, I'm sure many of you will be aware how important the gut flora is to our health. 80% of the immune system's in the gut. It really supports our health. But what about our brain? So did you know that there is this two-way communication that goes on between the gut and the brain? For example, I could talk about this for probably several hours just on its own. Bacteria communicate with each other by exchanging these substances called organic acids. So we communicate by exchanging words. They exchange these substances called organic acids in the gut. Those organic acids travel directly up the vagus nerve and act as neurotransmitters on the brain. So depending on what kind of bacteria you've got and what kind of conversations they're having, that can affect your brain. How amazing is that? So, and there have been lots of studies, some studies in humans where they've used bacteria to influence things like mood, and there have been a ton of animal studies where they've shown different changes in behaviour. So, you know, for example, there's one study which is, so they have different kinds of mice. So some mice are genetically predisposed towards being anxious, and there are some mice who are genetically predisposed towards being relaxed. So when they do studies, they always find that anxious mice, behave in an anxious way, and so on, according to all the tests. So they took these two different kinds of mice and they swapped over their gut bacteria. The anxious mice became relaxed. The relaxed mice became anxious. So their gut bacteria overrode their genetic predisposition. So that's pretty incredible. And there's all differences in repetitive grooming and social behaviour and all these sorts of things. It was incredible studies. So the phrase is psychobiotics. So we know we've got antibiotics, probiotics, prebiotics, psychobiotics. It's the term that is being coined to kind of talk about the psychological effects of the bacteria in the gut. So where does the bacteria in the gut come from? Well, of course, it starts in the womb. We actually get bacteria in the womb, and then ideally we get a face full of bacteria on the way out when we're born. If you're born by C-section, obviously you miss out on that, so that babies don't have that same exposure to the bacteria. And through breast milk, and then ideally children spend time outdoors, and they stick stuff in their mouths, and they're getting more bacteria in that way. And but we live in quite a sterile world. We're sort of wet wiping everything, and not back in the day when sort of a baby dropped its dummy and you put it back in its mouth. Now it has to be cleaned, sterilised, and but actually all of that bacteria. I mean, obviously. Might be depending on it's different if you're on the tube versus in the countryside, obviously. So, but that bacteria that we are exposed to, it contributes to the bacterial development in the gut. And what we want ideally in the gut is a really diverse and full kind of ecosystem in the gut, the same as you would for any other ecosystem. And we also used to have a lot more fermented foods in our diet. So obviously with the advent of preservatives and refrigeration and pasteurisation, we eat fewer foods which have normal live bacteria in them. So things like cesarean births, maternal antibiotics, formula feeding, refrigeration, etc., and those sorts of things all have reduced the development of the gut flora. So some children still have a great gut flora, but many children, just from the normal things that happen going through life, tend to have less good bacteria. And so we've got 10 times more bacteria in the gut than we have got human cells, and it's a constantly sort of evolving thing. So it's like an ecosystem. So if you think about the Amazon rainforest as an ecosystem, and what you want in that Amazon rainforest is lots of different species that are all kind of jammed in there together, that are all kind of a healthy environment. And that's the ideal environment in the gut. So how do we get a better gut flora? So fibrous foods, well-chewed, things like vegetables and pulses. So what we eat is food for the bacteria. And if we eat food which is kind of quite highly processed and doesn't have a lot of fibre in it, obviously by the time it all gets down to where the bacteria live in the large colon, there's not really much left for them to eat. And so making sure they get the right kind of food can be really helpful. Fermented foods, so many of you I'm sure would have seen that the fermented foods are kind of making a bit of a comeback, so there's, more sort of sauerkraut in the supermarket, and things like kimchi and kefir and yogurt obviously has been around for a long time, but so these fermented foods are making a bit of a comeback, and they are a good way of sort of delivering more bacteria into the gut in the old-fashioned way. The downside is that they aren't necessarily children's favourite foods, but there are some which are quite nice tasting, and you can make them at home, so it can be quite a fun thing to do at home. You can buy sort of like a starter pack of, like for kefir grains, for example, and you keep them in a jar in the kitchen, and you feed them every day, and then you pour off the liquid, and if you put the right things in there, it kind of tastes a bit like ginger beer, and it's teeming with bacteria, so that can be kind of a fun little project for some people. And there's Kombucha Tea, which you can do as well. So these sort of things are available in the health food shop and the supermarket, but also you can make them at home once you get the live cultures. But if you just Google, you can get hold of them. Be aware that if you're buying fermented foods, then sometimes they'll be pasteurised. So if the food manufacturer is wanting to protect us from bacteria, so they obviously once it's pasteurised, the bacteria are dead. So just kind of be aware that might have happened. So, and then there's a big campaign running at the moment about avoiding unnecessary antibiotics. So sometimes antibiotics are necessary, of course, and they should be used as necessary. But in line with kind of national recommendations, I say avoiding anything which is unnecessary. But also, when antibiotics are necessary, then probiotics, followed by probiotics, is a really good way of replenishing the bacteria in the gut. And going for a good, hefty dose from the health food shop, not the little pots from the supermarket, because they tend to be quite low potency and high in sugar, but to support gut flora or to replenish them after antibiotics, my recommendation would be to go to a good health food shop and ask the well-trained staff, what would you recommend? What's a good sort of 1 month course of probiotics that I can give to my child who's just been on antibiotics for a week or so, and then you kind of reducing some of the damage. Food sensitivities. So, who's kind of looked at or heard about the gluten, dairy-free, gluten casein-free? A few people, yeah. So I know it can be a bit controversial. It sounds a bit alternative, I think, to some people, this idea that there could be these foods that we eat that are part of our everyday diet that actually could be, bad for some people. And so with gluten, so many of you will be familiar with something called celiac disease, which is a really severe allergy to gluten. But who's heard of non-celiac gluten sensitivity? Okay, so it's a thing. Your GP will know about it, and basically it's just listen. Yeah, some of them are still catching on, but I know there are GPs who know what it is, and it's in the literature. They can Google it. So you can have celiac disease, but you can also have sensitivity to gluten, which is not celiac disease. So what happens is the GP runs the test for celiac disease, it comes back, it says it's negative, and they say, put your child back on gluten. And you say, but my child is unwell on gluten. And so hopefully they recognise, maybe this child has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The problem is there is no test for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So it's just from observations of potentially an exclusion time. And so there are some, just put up some examples here of some studies that have been published recently that are talking about the range of neurological disorders in patients with celiac disease, but also the gluten syndrome, a neurological disease. So most people, when we think about celiac disease, we think about it's just a digestive disorder, but actually it can also affect the brain, and it's linked with a whole range of other issues. The other kind of main culprits would be dairy, soya, yeast, and maybe even eggs. With with gluten, there's actually more evidence. With dairy, the evidence is even weaker, so we're on kind of even shakier ground. But for many people, things like gluten and dairy in particular can be problematic in terms of affecting physical health and mental health. So some people might have, they might cause mouth ulcers, some people will be digestive symptoms, some people it might be, mood or hyperactivity, some people it'll give them spots, some people get migraines. It can affect people in lots of different ways. I think this is why it's so difficult to pin down, because for any individual person, it just seems incredible that it could be such a wide range of symptoms. And also because it's not like an allergy where if someone has a peanut allergy, they eat a peanut, they know about it immediately. With these types of allergies, they involve a different part of the immune system. They don't have an immediate severe reaction, they don't affect the airways, they don't tend to cause a rash. So they're the sort of foods that we tend to have in our everyday diet. So the consumption of them can kind of go on day after day after day, and the symptoms are there day after day after day. So it's very difficult to see any kind of correlation. And so the only way really there are food intolerance tests which are available. They're still not, I would say, they're quite reliable, but there's more to food intolerance than we are able to test for. So one of the best ways to actually figure it out is to do an exclusion diet, which of course, not easy, but can be really life-changing. By cutting out things like gluten and dairy, for most people a month is plenty. For some people 2 weeks is enough, but I would say try and go for a month, and then you can be sure. And do it as an experiment, and just try not to think about, what about the long term, how are we going to manage, and just think, let's just do it for a month, see what happens. Ideally the whole family, because it might sound like it's more difficult for the whole family, but actually it's easier, because if everyone's doing it, then you can kind of change what's in the house, and the child that you're most concerned about obviously is not going to feel like poor them, now they're having to kind of eat different food and so on. So there are lots of gluten-free and dairy-free alternative foods available, but I would just caution against getting too carried away with them, because they're not necessarily all very healthy foods. So I would try to, rather than lots of gluten-free pasta and gluten-free cake and gluten-free biscuits, and try to just kind of maybe have more rice, more potatoes, and so on. And likewise with the dairy products, rather than drinking sort of a litre of rice milk a day, maybe just have water. But obviously you have to tailor it to your individual situation. Eggs I put as a question mark, because they are such a good food that I hate to ever exclude them from anyone's diet, but we have to recognise that they are kind of fifth on the list. So I tend to, in practice, I tend to not exclude them initially, even for a trial period, because I just really don't want to have to cut them out. But if a child is eating them every single day, then we might do a short period of exclusion just to check. So, key takeaways then. So ADHD is a complex neurobiological disorder for which there's no simple solution. I think that's one of the key messages, that it's not all about dopamine and noradrenaline, and that actually there's a broad range of biochemical factors which can influence any child, and that each child's situation is unique to them. So it's about finding out what those specific factors are important for them. But I've highlighted through the talk the most important factors to look at. And so nutritional therapy can have an enormous impact on your child's mental and physical health, enabling them to be all they can be. And the good thing is that the side effects of nutritional therapy include better health. So it's better health for them for the long term. And of course, I have to admit that it's not easy changing children's diets. It requires persistence and patience and some deep breathing at times. It doesn't get easier when they get older, so I would say if you're thinking, gosh, it's not easy for it to do with a 2-year-old, it's not easy with a 5-year-old, and it's definitely harder when they get to 7, and it's harder again when they get to 10. So if you've got younger children and you want to do some of this stuff, I would say the sooner the better. But having said that, it's never too late. You just have to have different approaches, different sort of buy-in. And just my almost final slide is I like this paper which was published in 2015 talking about the introduction of vitamin C for scurvy. Slow acceptance of nutritional interventions is not unusual. So Captain James Lancaster carried out a cohort study in 1601 which showed that lemon juice prevented scurvy. 1601. On a voyage from England to India, sailors on one ship took lemon juice daily, on the other 3 did not. Halfway through the voyage, none of the ship taking lemon juice had died, whereas 40% of the sailors on the other 3 ships had perished. The experiment was repeated 146 years later. In 1747 by James Lind, a physician. Despite the evidence, practices still did not change. It took another 48 years for the British Navy to order citrus fruits to be provided on Navy ships. However, universal preventive policy was not enacted for another 70 years after that. So it was 264 years from the first trial which showed the effect until a change in national policy. So I'm hoping we don't have to wait quite that long. And finally, by all means do get in touch, connect with me on social media, etc. And or if you just have questions, I'm